Greetings, friends. On behalf of the Trivon Media Group, I extend you a very hearty welcome to the weekly High with LSD show. If you're wondering why LSD, it stands for L. Subramaniam, founder and CEO of Trivon. He's better known as Subu, and Leslie DeMonte, that's me. So much for LSD. Now, those of you who viewed this episode last week would recall that we discussed the rich intellectual legacy that the late Mr. F.C. Kohli left behind, even as we touched upon the evolution of the Indian IT industry and the impact of digital transformation. This week, we will cover three topics. The first is H-1B visas and Joe Biden, what's in store for tech companies now that the Trump is no longer will give up his post in January. The second part is on how tech companies view AI and ethics. The trigger, of course, is that the Google AI ethics co-lead has resigned or sacked this week. It's not very clear whether she has resigned or whether she has been sacked, but we'll get to that in a bit. The third is that Bitcoin prices are shooting through the roof. Now, is this a bubble? Is this a sign of the times for the digital payments industry? Let's find out. We have with us an industry expert too, Jayant Kola. Now, Jayant Kola is the founder and partner of deep tech consultancy and advisory firm Convergence Catalyst. He is a person who's a teetotaler, but he's high on technology. So, Jayant, did you like the name LSD?
I loved it. I totally loved it when you told me about it a few days back. Good job, both you and Subbu, honestly.
Okay, great. So hopefully now we'll make the LSD conversation also as lively. Let's start with the highly sensitive topic of H-1B visas. Of course, the good news is that the US court has annulled the two H-1B regulations suggested by the Trump administration this week. As we all know that Indian citizens or the people from India are the most interested national group in the H-1B visa category, given that about 70% of H-1B visas were either issued or renewed for citizens in India.
Right.
So Trump has actually ended the H-1B computerized lottery system, and they decided, and it was actually in October, I think they had decided to limit the validity of the H-1B visa for 1 year instead of 3.
Right.
Now, both these provisions have been annulled by the court. Jayant, very quickly, since you have been tracking the Indian IT industry from the H-1B visas, you know that this is a big issue and a political rhetoric that goes on time and again. Every time there are elections, you will have these, you'll have the parties deciding either way. Jakob.
I think what can be expected from the Joe Biden's administration is nothing but good news. At least what the 4 years have been for the Indian IT industry as far as H-1B visas are concerned. Because if you look at it historically, as far as the Indian IT industry is concerned, the Obama era was the best when it comes to H-1B visas and the and various benefits and advantages that have been given for various visa holders, including the H-4 dependents, were allowed to work. And the Trump administration came and put in a lot of restrictions, including something as recent as only people with IT degrees, to be given H-1B visas, and then asking the unis to give only IT undergrads the IT masters seats and stuff like that. So there have been a lot of restrictions. Thankfully, the courts have annulled them, and the Democratic Party and the administration has always been favorable. So the Indian IT industry, from our research, when we speak to the people there, they're looking forward for nothing but good times as compared to the last 4 years.
You also have a lot of interest in US companies out there. You know how these things play out during every elections. But this time it seemed to have been a very serious move. So probably all Indian IT companies and even the US companies, for that matter, because of the competitive trade advantage that they get because of outsourcing, would be heaving a sigh of relief.
Okay, so Jayant mentioned that Obama time was the best time that we had. Let's also remember that Obama lost, Clinton lost quite badly, right? Now, let's also understand that it is a very divisive mandate that Biden has inherited. 72 million votes for Trump is not a trivial issue at all. Secondly, if you look at the noises coming from the Biden camp, it is that they want to now look at, unifying America. Now, just take these two things together. I am not expecting a massive rollback on H-1B decisions taken by Trump. I expect two things. I expect that the administration will probably go stable. The problem with Trump was that it was not stable, it was unpredictable.
Right.
The second issue that I think is going to happen is that a lot of decisions are going to be taken by the courts, and the administration will probably just play the ball as it comes. Because let's understand that today the problem that Biden has is that Democrats are seen having too correct politically. The entire South, Midwest is not with Democrats. The white American over 50 population is decisively voted for Trump. Now, these are very, very large pockets of influence. Texas is a very large pocket of influence for the United States as a whole. So from a political standpoint, I expect not very major announcements on H-1B. However, I do expect that there will be a season of stability that will happen, predictability that will be there, right? You won't have knee-jerk reactions, right? But if we are expecting any major concessions, I don't think that's going to happen. I think Biden will, at least in the first 2 years, till he gets somewhere close to a majority in Senate, he's probably going to be playing a lot more coy. Also understand that his vice president-elect is of Indian origin. So he would not want to be seen as something which is extremely pro-Indian, extremely pro, H-1B, because that could have a serious backlash in the southern and midwestern states of the United States of America. So status quo to the extent that it is favorable. Do I expect a massive rollback? I don't expect it, at least not in the first 2 years. But I think a lot of decisions will be, since they have been initiated by Trump, they'll get challenged and the courts will take. And the other caveat here, let's also understand, is that the Supreme Court of the United States is today heavily Republican, especially after the last judge who was sworn in just a few weeks ago. So with a 6-3 kind of a majority that the Republicans have, the conservatives have, I should not use the word Republican, the conservatives have, I think immediate rollbacks are not going to be realistic. However, the circuit courts will probably have their own say and they'll have their own decisions. Unless and until something is challenged and taken to the Supreme Court, I don't see too much of the boat being rocked. Okay, so my prognosis is stability, predictability, sanity, right? And probably a bit of a swing to the large businesses, the big business, which obviously wants the H-1B regime to be a little more liberal than what it has been, and little less, little less caustic or toxic, as it's been. So that is what I expect to see. I think it's good news for us, but not really something that I'm ready to start the celebrations on.
Yeah. So the point is, let's not get onto the streets and cry, hallelujah, kind of. Let us be a little cautious. I mean, we need to be very cautious.
Let's just wait. Let's just wait, because there's a whole lot of things that are going to. And look, also let's understand that there is going to be 20 days or 30 days from here till the inauguration. A lot of things can happen given the current president's point of view.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, to be fair also to this, I think we cannot pass over these facts during these conversations, is that many Indian IT companies have actually opened up units out there in the US, in Europe, and all this. This has increase their costs definitely because they have to pay proper wages, US kind of wages. Probably the relief that they have got at this point in time is, I think, uh, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know the exact figure. I think they wanted a 40%. The Trump administration wanted a 40% rise in the H-1B kind of visas. So I think that would have added to the cost. So these guys, the Indian IT industry, have already recruited a lot of people in the US, in Europe, and 60% of the 50 to 60% of the revenue anyway comes from these companies.
See, the good thing that may happen. I mean, it's in the real politic. It is not supposed. I'm not supposed to say a good thing, but is that Biden's stance on China is going to be as strident.
Yes,
He is going to be
that's
tight, right? Therefore, we may have some kind of a tailwind out there. Okay,
Right.
that's possible. That's possible.
Right.
But by itself, I'm not ready to pop the champagne bottles yet.
Yeah, and Leslie, to your point, one other thing that we have observed is the entire COVID-led work from home, situation, which this year, we've seen, and we've done some research, and of all the big, major IT companies, it was Infosys, which actually this year has reduced its recruitment in US especially by 40 to 55% and moved all the on-site jobs to offshore because work from home, the employees can sit anywhere and work, and they're getting the cost arbitrage as well, right? So that is also happening. So that's another factor, at least for the next year or two, that needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to H-1B visas. When the employees can go there and work from home, companies are looking at moving some on-site jobs to offshore.
In fact, that is a good thing, because had Trump been there, he would have changed work from home to work from American homes.
Yeah. He did that actually. Yeah.
So I mean, this is the kind of predictability that I'm saying. Work from home means work from home. It doesn't matter where you are. Okay, it doesn't mean you have to work from American homes or Puerto Rican homes or District of Columbia homes or whatever it is. I think that is the change that I'm going to see.
Sure.
So if there is a rule, let's play by the rule. Trump's problem was there was no playing by the rules because there were no rules. The rules depended on which side of the bed he got off. Right?
Unpredictable. Yeah.
So let's hope basically that Joe Biden spells in at least some measure some kind of good news for the Indian IT industry. Let's keep our fingers crossed on that. And as you said, the dark horse literally is Kamala Harris, because what we feel that might work in favor of India might actually backfire, because you may say, I don't want to be seen as favoring
India. Exactly.
So that, let's see how it pans out. But I'm glad the good news as of now is that the courts have annulled those two Trump diktats. So maybe that's a good start for 2021. The next topic that I wanted to discuss this week, and which I thought was very important for all of us, was that Timnit Gebru, the co-lead of Google's AI ethics team, she put up a tweet which is all over the internet saying that I have been sacked. Google, I was looking at the Google letter put out by Jeff Dean. I have interviewed him at one point in time. So yes, I know his thoughts about AI and about AI and ethics, and I had grilled him on that even earlier. So I have a fair idea of how the man thinks. But this particular tweet sort of has created quite an uproar over the internet, especially because Gebru had contributed a lot towards the entire thing about how algorithms are biased towards people of color. And I think that's a very valid point, because I remember, Jayant, and maybe I've discussed this at length over the last 1-2 years. Now, MIT Technology Review published an article just yesterday. I think just yesterday. He said that this article is based on a copy of the research that Gebru had put out. The crux of the problem, why exactly this sacking or resignation has happened. The title of that research is On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. Can language models be too big? So I think she has raised two pertinent questions. A, that AI trains on very large data models. So there can be a lot of inherent biases because it is taking data from the internet, taking data from all public kind of sources, and human beings are biased. So the bias obviously creeps into these large data models. So, and the second point that she also raised was the carbon emissions, because obviously we all know that one of the secrets or the success of AI depends also is actually a factor, or it depends so much on the computing power. The more the computing power, the better the AI function, because it can run faster on the model.
Yeah.
But that also creates a much larger carbon footprint. So she has questioned both of these and asked whether we need to train larger AI data models, or should we have smaller data models that it can that are more nuanced in their understanding of the human languages, etc. So other than gender discrimination and race bias that is seen in algorithms, we have so many cultures around the world. In India, we have the caste system and class system. So I think this is a very, very important topic. I know Jayant's thoughts. That's why I'll call Jayant onto later. But Subbu, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know you think quite differently on the subject.
No, I look, the code, the data, the backend architecture is being created by human beings, right?
True.
All the inherent biases that we have are going to find their way into those data models, into the architecture itself, right? There is no way as of now that we have been able to figure out an AI to write AI. Okay. Now, I'll give you a very small example as to how AI can actually bias the entire society, right? If you look at the Google's algorithms today, and particularly in the news consumption pattern, you end up getting the kind of news that you want to read, that you like to read, and that you're used to be reading.
Echo
It
chamber.
figures it out. It's not really a big deal out there, right? Now, what happens is that if I'm in India and I like to, let's say I'm right wing, so to speak, right? I keep getting that content only, keep getting served that content. With the result, my views and my thoughts become completely polarized. Now, you can see that happening in India today. You can see that happening in the US today, right? Now, that is a very small aspect of how AI really changes the society structure in some sense. Now, if you take that out and now transpose it to things like race, things like caste, things like color, right? You're going to definitely have, what shall I say, asymmetric solutions coming out. Now, Gebru's point of view was that, listen, we are not doing enough. We are not being, truly agnostic in true sense of the word. My answer to that is, look, we have never been, fair. Who says that Google has to be fair? Let's understand, Google is a profit-making corporation. Yes, it may make noises about being fair, and it probably is doing a lot of stuff. Is it enough? No, it's never enough, because at the end of the day, you are not going to be able to remove the biases that have been built over thousands of years by a computer program. It's not going to happen. What is the solution? I don't know. The narrative today on AI is so nascent, right? That there is very little of really, what shall I say, reality that's coming in. I think what we need to do is, I think answer to your question is that, Leslie, we probably need to take smaller chunks, smaller models, apply them, see how they work, and then start building larger models. Going for a larger, massive model, it's just not going to work, because it is going to have the inherent faults and the biases that we already have.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Gebru was saying, and even Jayant and all we were talking about, that these are the echo chambers or the confirmation bias that you already have. And it's virtually impossible, because saying that AI has a bias, it's a bias in itself, actually, for
Yeah,
not sure.
absolutely.
So when you look at, yeah, I mean, when you look at it from a philosophical point of view, just look at ethics. Now, when you say AI and ethics, ethics itself is such a complex kind of animal out there for human beings to understand and grapple with. And no two people agree whether there's a God. There are agnostics, there are atheists, there are people who believe in one God, there are people who believe in another God. There's so many kinds of different biases that we already function with. People believe that if you have a good education, you'll become you can sort of shine in society. There are some people who feel that you don't require education. They point out to people like Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and says, see here, you have college dropouts, and you have some excellent guys. Here you had the whole a person who ran Nirma out here, who was a founder CEO who did not do an MBA today, and then he recruited so many MBAs out there. So these kind of biases keep on existing, and there are tons of these examples. Uh, Jen, your thoughts on the Google thing, because you have interacted on both sides of this
Yeah.
offense. Uh, let me hear your thoughts first, then we'll take this
So
conversation.
yeah, taking forward from what Subbu said, just a couple of days back, I came across a meme on Facebook, right? Irony. Okay. A parent asked, if all your friends jump off the bridge, okay, will you too? The machine learning algorithm says yes, right? Because it's been trained on data. It's been trained on historical data,
Exactly.
right? So, but yeah, I completely agree with what Subbu said. Number one, first of all, we are in the early nascent stages of AI evolution. Okay, in terms of the technology itself is in its infancy in terms of what realizing its potential, and and very early in that, I mean, we've seen probably only scratch the surface when it comes to the use cases and applications of what AI is capable of. And people have to understand that the technology itself is continuously evolving, and now the algorithm bias and ethics in AI is a favorite topic of everybody around the world. Okay, and there are some very intelligent, mature, and very learned people who are working on it continuously. As the as many or as intelligent and experts working on developing use cases and algorithms, use cases and applications using the technology, there are equal number of people who are working on, or equally intelligent people and experts who are working on the reducing the bias and and ethics in AI. But as Subbu said, and as Leslie you also mentioned, the bias is going to be inherent, because guess what? I mean, it's humans at the end of the day who are writing these algorithms, and we humans are not perfect. We are not unbiased. Okay, and also currently AI is a one-trick pony. I mean, all AI is boils down to backward propagation. I mean, it requires data, and data is going to be of all forms, right? So the way to live with it is essentially develop a framework, of continuously checking or reducing, the kind of bias. See, technically, the way to do it is low data techniques. The amount of data sets, the amount of data that is required to train the models, okay, that needs to come down, and there's a lot of work happening on that any which ways. I mean, low data techniques is being worked upon. Okay, so that way, as the amount of data and the size of the data sets reduces, okay, the bias would also reduce. But then there needs to be a proper framework, policy framework, technology and policy framework for reducing the bias, and that also needs to be completely iterative continuously, right? So that's one way to work at it. But if you come down to this particular case of Google, I mean, if you look at the company, right? I mean, we've been working with Google for a long time, and we all of us know Google as a company to some extent or the other. I mean, this is the company which started off saying, attracting the best and the most mavericks, the best in the field, and gave them a platform to work to their will and just make a dent in the world continuously, right? And over the years, and in the last 2.5 decades, we've seen the company do that. And what happens is when the company grows to a certain size as big as Google, you'll always have these people, some of them coming out being outspoken and maverick. I mean, we've seen that when this gentleman wrote a memo during the Me Too movement. He put out his
Yep.
thoughts. Yeah. And then again, the Google employees protesting against Google working with Pentagon and Pentagon defense contracts, right? Eventually, Google had to pull back and Microsoft, the contracts went to Microsoft. But having said that, knowing internally, Google is also the workplace that we know where it encourages, its employees to work on it. They have so many forums that they discuss, they out completely be open and discuss their thoughts.
They have
Yeah,
the
they
AI
have
principles. They have on all these companies, in fact.
all these companies, right? So, they've created this kind of a workplace and scaled it. And as an entrepreneur, I know how tough it is to scale that. I mean, we all want many entrepreneurs to work for us, but controlling them is,
Absolutely.
saying that these kind of things probably happen, but we need to look at it as I probably look at it as a one-off event.
So,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
more issue that I want to highlight, Leslie, is that, we've talked about bias, okay? And we understand that bias is going to be there. Now, we say that bias comes in when, because the human beings who are writing the code and so on and so forth, and we get that. But the other issue that is troubling me a lot is more than the bias, is the opacity of the AI systems. Now, if you had, ML in as a part of the AI, because it's machine language, even the expert, even the guy who is managing the system will not be able to know as to what the pattern that the program is actually identifying. Now, when you combine these two, the opacity and the bias, okay, then it becomes extremely problematic. Now, the solution, therefore, again, is that don't create the mother of all AI programs. Okay, create smaller programs, work with them, okay, and see how you can reduce the opacity, mitigate the bias using, technology. And the other thing that's probably going to happen, sooner rather than later, is that this problem is probably going to get handled more by the political class rather than the tech class.
True.
I think it is where the political will have to come in and say, okay, I'm not going to do it. Like IBM said, I'm not going to do facial recognition, right? And that's a good stance to take. But hey, I'm not IBM, right? Tomorrow, if I get a chance to make a few dollars, I'll do that. So it is the political will that is probably needs to come in, from the United States, because that's where the entire technology is being created, and it is then has to percolate down to the societies across the world. To me, bias is a problem. Opacity is another problem that we need to deal with.
So you raised valid questions, except that a lot of work has been done in this entire region of even opacity. So basically, you have something called explainable AI, so which even companies like Wipro here down in India have been using to a very great extent. And most companies now use this whole term called explainable AI. I think this is a term that has been developed by DARPA. So Pentagon came up with this whole thing called the explainable AI model, where it basically says the very same issue that you raised, saying that if there's an algorithm, deep learning algorithms, or whether machine learning, deep learning algorithm, they have to explain how they arrived at this conclusion. The same way that if you and me make a statement, we have to explain on what database, what is the source of that data, so that people understand, and there can be some sort of a peer-to-peer review kind of stuff of this particular thing. So there are those. And another thing that the World Economic Forums and the ethics AI committees that are where most of these tech companies are part of these committees, basically they talk about something called humans in the loop. So that's something that is very important.
Hybrid AI.
Yeah, the hybrid AI part of it, because it says that, okay, just AI creating AI code was not going to help, because there'll be too much confusion out there. There has to be some kind of a moderation level, so that you at some point in time know that humans are looking at whatever is the end result is. And I always, so Jayant knows me, and typically remind me that I often use this Marvin Minsky quote. So Marvin Minsky is one of the co-founders of the word AI. So he always said that even if AI becomes sentient at some point in time and starts thinking like a human or emulates human and becomes more intelligent than human, he said, I'm paraphrasing what he said. So he said, I'm not too worried, because then the thinking of an AI algorithm would be as muddled as that of a human being. So he's fine with it. And I think
Exactly.
that's a step, that if you expect AI to be that kind of sentient kind of thing, it will be as
Perfect.
muddled as the way we think. And we really don't know whether we'll see a sentient AI in our kind of lifetime. But I think these kind of conversations, these kind of debates, and this whole uproar over Gebru is important, because we need to have these kind of debates so that there's some kind of balance, as we rightly pointed out. We can actually talk on this topic till the cows come home, because this is a never-ending topic. Let me move on to the third topic, which is Bitcoins, another as interesting a topic as ever. Now, I think so. Bitcoin was launched about 11 years ago, and today it is the largest cryptocurrency by market cap. I think it's around 200 million,
Billion. Yep.
$200 billion dollars as of today. The current value in INR terms is around over a little over 14 lakhs in India. So about, I think about 20,000, $19,500 or so. And according to Crypto Research Report, they are saying by 2030, the value would double to something like 40, around, $397,000. A major Tesla investor has predicted that the Bitcoin will be worth more than $1 trillion in under 10 years. So everybody is like fascinated by Bitcoin. I remember the conversation that we used to have about till 4 years back, and RBI had clamped down and said that, okay, fine, you have to treat this Bitcoins with a lot of caution. Then we suddenly moved to blockchain, saying that the underlying technology, which is the distributed ledger technology, the DLT technology, is what is going to change the world, and it's a answer to everything. So practically every consultant in town I know started saying that it's you can it's not only for your supply chain, you can, even a CEO can be a blockchain enabled, and so on and so forth. So it got crazy at that point in time. Now the focus is back on Bitcoins, and because I think in March the Supreme Court said that it is legal tender. It can in India. So there's a lot of newfound interest in Bitcoins. Subbu, I know you're itching to talk about Bitcoin.
No, I mean, look, I mean, if you look at it, there was a time when Bitcoin went to $3,500, and now it is at about $15,000, right?
$20,000 almost.
Yeah, 20. So here is, see, there are essentially 4 primary reasons why I think this Bitcoin surge has happened. One is that COVID created a vacuum, and there was a rush to safe haven assets, gold, okay, and therefore Bitcoin became that much more critical, and there was an increase in price. The second, I think, important thing that I noticed was that it became institutional. PayPal, for example, started allowing Bitcoins, right? Now, when you have an institutional acceptance, and you're no longer, below the radar kind of, right? Then it becomes that much more easy and amenable for people, right, to deal with Bitcoins. And the interesting thing is that if you look at companies, I mean, I know for a fact that MicroStrategy, okay, has actually invested in Bitcoins as a part of its balance sheet. Okay, so it is now showing Bitcoins as an asset class in its balance sheet. The other companies have, but there's a class of companies, and largest amongst them is MicroStrategy. And I think this trend is going to, probably accelerate in 2021. Okay. Yeah. The last is that, let's understand, there are only going to be 21 million Bitcoins, period, you already have about 18.8 million, right?
It's a supply
Which
demand
means that
issue.
it's a supply demand
Supply
issue.
demand. It's a supply
Right.
demand issue.
The last time it went to 3,500, I mean, I just looked at the stock to flow ratio of Bitcoins, right? Now, the stock to flow has always been limited, but there was a resistance at 14,000. Today, what people are saying is that 2021 end, you're going to see Bitcoin at $100,000.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't see, barring anything else happening, if institutions are going to accept Bitcoins as legal tender, then I see no reason why Bitcoin should not go further. And I think this court ruling in India that it is legal tender is actually a good thing, because it's now going to allow a lot of people who are subterranean, in India, to actually come up to the surface and say, hey, listen, we are going to be dealing in Bitcoins. So
Direct question to you. Are you interested in investing? Would you invest in a Bitcoin?
If I had the money, definitely yes. Definitely yes.
Okay, good. That's a frank enough statement. Jayant, a lot of guys are creating IP over this. A lot of startups and all that.
Yeah.
Bitcoin startups.
Yeah.
What's your sense?
I'll take over from again where Subbu left. The court ruling in India, he ended with saying the last point. The court ruling in India is going to let a lot of guys in India who are subterranean to come up. If you look at the last rally in 2017, okay, a lot of people who have invested, and in 2018 it fell by 80%. A lot of people who lost were the Chinese retail investors. Okay, the Chinese, individual investors who did not know anything, but they invested. But if you look at the trends, right? So I'm going to be talking about trends. Subbu talked about a few of them, but historically, if you see, Bitcoin has a 4-year halving cycle. Every 4 years,
Yep.
the Bitcoin has. Okay, so that creates a supply-demand issue. So last time, 2012, November, December, it halved. The trend has been every year it halved. The next calendar year, the Bitcoin price surged, right? 2012, November, December, it halved. 2013, Bitcoin price surged by 5,500%. Okay, we never realized that because the price was really less, and it's only in 2016 when it halved, and 2017 rally we all observed it. The price surged. The calendar year of 2017, the price surged by 1,400%. That's when it hit the previous peak of 19,000 odd, right? In December. But then the following year, 2014, there was a correction of about 60-70%. 2018, the correction of about 80%. Again, fast forward 4 years, 2020 in May, the Bitcoin halved. Okay. Now, around that time, like Subbu said, it was around $3,500, and I predicted it to go down to 3,500, and I told my friends to pick it up. I picked up a little of it, but I'm, now it's hit its all-time high of 19,510, and the very next day it got back. So, I'm going to be talking about two forecasts, short-term and long-term. Short-term is
before that, I'd like to say we are friends, huh?
Absolutely. And we talked about it. And you said what Subbu said, if I had the money. Right? So 2021, I see some 4 or 5 key trends that are going to be pushing the Bitcoin bull run. If you just follow the pattern every 4 years, the calendar year after the halving, the pattern has been, it's grown. So we can, following the same pattern, we can expect a bull run. Number one. Number two, and most importantly, what Subbu said is the institutional investors getting in. Now we have a sophisticated type of investor coming in. We have these companies, their CFOs who are saying, okay, let's set aside about X percentage of our cash and park it in Bitcoin. Okay, and they have a long-term view. They don't play with volatility. Okay, they have a long-term view. So the investor class, okay, it's getting more mature and sophisticated, right? So, we're going to see that a lot in 2021. And Goldman Sachs actually set aside, built a complete crypto fund. Now, and the third thing is, most importantly, the tools to hold the profit for investors in right now are that much more. Back in 2013 or even 2017, okay, all you could do with Bitcoin profit was, sell it, pay your capital gain, and go buy your Lamborghini. Okay. Now, actually, Bitcoin is becoming an asset class where you can, borrow against it, where you can hold it as a collateral, like you can do with your stocks, right? So you don't have to pay the capital gain. So that also is making it an asset class.
It's a legitimate asset class now.
It's a legitimate asset class.
You have ATMs also. I think you can withdraw bitcoins from ATMs also. I think
in Europe, yes, they did come up with that. And more and the fourth thing, as Subbu pointed out, the supply. There are only 2.5 million left out of the 21 million for people to buy, right? And more people are going to know about it. The media is going to talk about it, and all that. And the fifth and the most important, trend that I'm going to see in 2021, which is going to, give Bitcoin a bull run, is the COVID-based economy, bubble burst. We haven't seen it completely yet. Okay, and we expect that to come up in 2021, the deflation, inflation, and hyperinflation cycle, right? Okay, and that in itself is going to shoo away investors, retail and institutional investors, from the stock market, from the existing investable assets. Okay, and then we see the entire media and this good thing happening cyclically for Bitcoin could push that up, right? So these are the 4 or 5 reasons that I see in 2021, Bitcoin is going to have a bull run. Even if it gets a 500% hike, this one, it's going to touch 100K, which a lot of people are talking about. Now, in the long term, I have a couple of concerns, okay? 2 concerns I have when it comes to Bitcoin is because Bitcoin and other altcoins and cryptocurrencies are still, considered only as tradable assets, and they haven't seen the real world applications and uses and tender as much, right? That they're still tradable classes, right? And the second thing is the evolution of national cryptocurrencies and digital currencies. Okay, our research said when we started, this year, there were only 8 countries which were, properly working on national cryptocurrencies. Fast forward to June 2021. That number increased to 80% of the world. 80% of the companies were either were working on sovereign, digital currencies, or at least doing research on them. And China has already launched digital yuan a few weeks back, right? So, when countries, sovereigns are working on their own national digital currencies, now cryptos and altcoins will sort of, become the counter culture and will always remain the counterculture. So will they see the mainstream acceptance in the long term, and then by extension, will they see the mainstream kind of a hype in the long term, is a concern that I have.
I'll add one more concern out here, is the security aspect. As of today, when we talk about blockchain, we see that sort of the impregnable kind of stuff.
Right. Right.
Because that is one of the strengths of a cryptocurrency, the underlying technology, which is blockchain. And we say, okay, fine, since it's blockchain, it's transparent and it's secure. These are the couple of strengths. But 2 developments that happened. One was, of course, Google, and second was China, because they came up with these quantum computers. So, so when we spoke about quantum computer, they are talking about quantum supremacy. Google spoke about quantum supremacy some time back. Now the implication is on Bitcoins, because blockchains become hackable. You can break the code, basically. Now, whether you can create AI run a kind of code which will counter this particular trend, I'm not too sure about that. They are talking about that simultaneously. But that could be one of the concerns, basically. And where China is involved, of course, we all know what the ramifications could be, because China, as it is, if I understand it, it's already hostile to cryptocurrencies. It's creating its own currency, the UNA coin. And so that could be one of those sort of variables or something that could spoil the party. The other thing is, I think in India, government taxes it as income, right? It's 30%. You already, you get into the high income brackets.
See, anyway. I mean, if you're investing in cryptocurrency, you're anyway in a 30% bracket. Okay, so that's as simple as that.
I don't think that. I don't think that's a real. I wouldn't agree with that observation. Bitcoins can be split into very small fragments also. In Gujarat, there are quite a few small guys who have actually invested in more as hobbyists and all that. You can
no, I know a lot of 24, 28-year-olds who are working in the IT industry, who
surely not in the 30%.
They're not in the 30% bracket yet.
Okay.
No, but you have a point.
But the fact is that, see, I agree with one thing that Jayant said, that crypto, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all of them, they are going to be sidelined because see, the market is going to be huge, right? If the market is going to be that big, there is no reason why the sovereigns won't enter the market. They are not going to allow a bunch of private, companies, consortiums to make so much money without them getting a share of it. And it's perfectly logical to think like that. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. And I think every country, okay, whether the United States or China or India or UAE or Bahrain, they are going to create their own cryptocurrency. Once
India was
that
thinking of it,
develops,
right? Jen?
Sorry?
India was already thinking of one of its.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
we-
no, India's
yeah.
working on it. Yeah.
Yeah,
India,
India's
everybody's
working
working on it. Everybody's
Everybody's working on it.
Yeah.
Right. So when that happens, obviously you're going to see these currencies, becoming secondary simply because the tender and the medium of exchange will also move, will also start including the sovereign cryptos.
Right.
Okay. And that is where the game is going to change. So, and it's like governments the world over, it's not going to happen in 2021. So you can expect a fairly long runway in 2021, but 22, I'm not sure. 23, I'm
Yeah.
certain
Exactly.
that the sovereign cryptos will become more important. The other thing is that let's also accept the fact that whether it is distributed ledger or any other security protocol that comes in, there will be a hacker out there who will break it. To say that this is impregnable is completely unrealistic.
Completely, absolutely.
Okay,
fully agree.
so are you going to see Bitcoin being hacked? Yes, I'm going to see it in 2021. Okay, I'm going to see that happen. I'm going to see even the sovereign cryptos before they are launched to already have a hack. Okay, because that's the nature of the game. I mean, that's human nature. I mean, that's what we talked about when we talked about artificial intelligence, right? It's human nature to be challenged by something. You come and tell me that, look, that is impregnable. I'll say, oh yeah, let me see.
Yeah, in fact, that's a challenge.
Yeah,
that's a challenge, and I'm going to accept it.
That's what hackers love.
And we also have to factor in the human greed, right? I mean, Bitcoins are going to be hacked and Bitcoins are going to disappear. Remember that the trading, the trading exchange owner who disappeared with all these Bitcoins. Yeah. I mean, we can't factor that out, especially when something is grows so big and so fast, right? And I think for me, the way I look at it, it's a very cultural example of the hippie culture of the 60s. They started all this movement, and all of a sudden in the 70s, the government took over, institutionalized this in the form of music and in the form of
it became mainstream, right? It became mainstream.
And exactly, and hippies are still, the guys who started the culture, counterculture, are minuscule and sidelined. Okay, so that could happen to the existing cryptos vis-a-vis the national digital currencies.
Yeah, but look at what happened in the mobile wallet space. You had UPI, which is just changed the entire game. Now, those guys, Subbu rightly pointed out that if the government start getting it, the sovereigns start getting into this space, then the others will have to be subservient and play a secondary role.
Absolutely.
UPI is a classic example
of that
platform. But yeah, we hope that the entire digital payment space will prosper because of this. And it's always good to have these kind of developments that enhance the space. The internet is a classic example. The internet also started out in that particular way.
I hope when you say sovereigns, you're including Google, right?
Yeah, of course. You have to include the sovereigns.
Oh my God, you're stepping into the big tech countries, the big tech sovereigns.
It's a good swipe that you have taken, but we'll leave that for another day. That it's a lovely discussion to have at some point in time. But lovely having you folks for this discussion. And friends, those of you who are watching this particular episode, next week we'll be taking up next week's highlights on this weekly high with LHD, and hope you folks are going to enjoy it as much. Please send us your feedback. And Jayant, thank you very much for being on the show, and we hope to get you for the other shows also. And have a lot of pointers.
Thank you, Subbu and Leslie. I really want to thank you for the first time ever you haven't cut me short. I mean, in all the panel discussions that you moderated, okay, and considering that we've actually overstepped time by a significant extent,
This is a webinar.
really thank you. Yeah, I
No,
really loved the.
You wait till the digital cut comes through.
Yes.
Really loved it. Subbu, totally enjoyed your
Thank you.
conversation, man.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Jayan. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Yeah, bye.